Hello, thank you all for being here. My name is Olivia, and I'll be presenting my master's research on bull kelp restoration and management in Northern California. First, I'll be taking you through a bit of background about kelp on a global scale, and then I'll bring it back to what's going on with bull kelp in Northern California waters. Then I'll step you through my two case studies on kelp restoration in Southern California and Tasmania, and we'll finish it off with restoration and management recommendations. Kelp typically grows in large stands to form dense kelp forests. They occur worldwide, dominating the shallow waters along subtidal rocky areas in temperate regions, and are present along approximately 25% of global coastlines. But today we'll just be focusing on Northern California, where this red box lies. Kelp forests support high amounts of productivity, making them hotspots for biodiversity, but increasing human impacts have led to high amounts of anthropogenic degradation worldwide, and marine resource managers are constantly trying to find innovative ways to protect and restore these complex ecosystems. Kelp forests provide many ecosystem services to both human and marine species. Globally, kelp forests can sequester roughly 200 million tons of atmospheric carbon annually, which has huge implications on carbon offset and climate change mitigation. They're responsible for cycling of nutrients through coastal food webs and provide nourishment, structural complexity, and shelter for many species across various trophic levels. In California, they're a critical asset to the economy as well, stimulating millions of dollars in revenue per year from commercial and recreational fisheries, including various finfish, abalone, and sea urchin, which are harvested for their gonads. And of course, there's ecotourism. Not only that, but they're beautiful and they're considered a treasure along coastlines worldwide. The bull kelp forests of Northern California exist in a state of equilibrium, with various species of invertebrates, plants, and mammals keeping each other's populations in check. Historically, sea otters had exerted top down control on various species within bull kelp forests, consuming sea urchin, abalone, and other invertebrates that graze on bull kelp. Large predatory sea stars like the sunflower starfish pictured on the bottom right here also exhibit control over sea urchin populations, and abalone, pictured bottom left, are a competitor of the sea urchin for space and food. All these interactions once successfully kept the bull kelp forests in a state of balance. Over the past decade, there have been extreme climatic and ecological disturbances that have shifted the state of bull kelp forests to sea urchin barrens. Sea otters were once hunted to near extinction before they were protected, and they've never really been able to reestablish north of San Mateo County. Harmful algal blooms in 2011 decimated abalone populations in Sonoma and Mendocino County and have not had success in reestablishing their populations. Then in 2013, there was a densovirus called the sea star wasting disease that spread all along the west coast from Baja to Alaska and caused the death of millions of sea stars, including a major sea urchin predator, the sunflower starfish that I showed you in the previous slide. All these species, which would normally relieve kelp from grazing pressures of the purple sea urchin, resulted in a chain reaction leading to the demise of bull kelp forests and this regime shift to urchin barrens. On top of these ecological stressors, California waters have experienced increased frequency of marine heat waves and El Nino years that are characterized by warm, nutrient poor waters. So, bull kelp growth, which relies on cold water and high nutrient levels, has been inhibited and not been able to reestablish in the wake of the intensified grazing by sea urchins. All of this has resulted in a 93% loss of bull kelp biomass in Northern California. This map on the right depicts what this disappearance looks like along Sonoma and Mendocino County coastlines from left to right in 4 areas that have had historically persistent bull kelp. And as you can see, it's quite a drastic shift in such a short period of time. These areas that were once teeming with biodiversity are now covered by extensive urchin barrens that support very little marine life, and the urchins that are left have very little desirability to fisheries due to their decreased gonad production, resulting from their state of starvation that they're in. The Greater Farallones Association has developed a bull kelp recovery program in partnership with the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary and California Department of Fish and Wildlife. The sanctuary manages this outlined area of 3,300 square miles of ocean and coastline. The purpose of my project is to provide restoration and management recommendations to the bull kelp recovery plan, and I've done this through 2 case studies on previous restoration efforts, one in Southern California and one in Tasmania. And here I'll address the best practices for sea urchin population control, as well as kelp enhancement techniques. My first case study was in Southern California, where there have been multiple projects to restore giant kelp, which has faced high amounts of loss over the past few decades due to similar circumstances as Northern California. An organization called the Bay Foundation led the Palos Verdes Kelp Restoration Project, and starting in 2013, they identified 150 acres of sea urchin barrens off the Palos Verdes Peninsula coast and began an urchin culling program in partnership with commercial urchin divers. So urchin culling is essentially the smashing of sea urchins, but it's not as scary as it sounds. Restoration areas for this project were located near marine protected areas, which prohibit fishing activities, and those marine protected areas also served as reference sites. Their efforts from 2013 to 2018 have proved to be successful at reducing sea urchin densities to their targeted value of less than 2 individuals per square meter, and they've been able to restore about 46 acres of giant kelp off the peninsula. They've observed increases in species diversity and abundance at most restoration sites, but sites inside marine protected areas still had higher abundance, which is most likely due to fishing restrictions. Researchers also took measurements of sea urchin gonosomatic index, which is just a fancy way of saying the ratio of gonad weight to body weight of the sea urchin. And the gonads are the part of the sea urchin that they're harvested for by fisheries. And they found that the gonad production was significantly increased in restored areas compared to barren areas, which demonstrates the importance of restoring kelp forests to urchin fishers through their increased economic incentive of reestablishing the sea urchin fishery. So all of their work demonstrates the importance of implementing a systematic culling program, as well as the potential to establish more marine protected areas to bull kelp restoration managers in Northern California. Efforts to enhance kelp growth in Southern California have been going on for a long time, and one particular study I've researched was the Southern California Regional Kelp Restoration Project, which was spearheaded by the California Coastkeeper Alliance. Their efforts included several reforestation techniques. They performed outplanting kelp that was grown in labs and classrooms, transplanting drift kelp to rocky substrates at restoration sites, and seeding sites by installing bags that release sporophylls, which are microscopic kelp spores. This project exhibited a lot of success in the first few years, with about a 10% survival rate of giant kelp at restoration sites, which sounds low but is actually very typical for kelp planting efforts. After that, though, they experienced much less success due to difficult ocean conditions and limited funding, and they switched to solely transplanting drift kelp and focused a lot on community engagement and classroom learning, where they were able to reach audiences of over 48,000 people and had close to 9,000 students participating in classroom kelp education programs. So that brings us to case study 2, which takes place in Tasmania. And in the coastal waters of eastern Tasmania, there's been an intrusion of warm water into the cold water system that's coming from the East Australian current, which is extending southwards for unknown reasons, but likely connected to intensified climatic patterns. This pattern is similar to what we've observed in Northern California with marine heat waves infiltrating coastal areas. And this intrusion into eastern Tasmania has also brought about the spread of long-spined sea urchins, which proliferate in warmer waters. So here I've synthesized experiments run by the University of Tasmania's Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies and the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation on various urchin population control mechanisms and research on increasing the resilience of giant kelp through thermal tolerance trials. On a small-scale effort, these researchers ran sea urchin eradication and control trials by experimenting with passive sea urchin culling by commercial abalone divers while they were fishing for abalone. Their findings showed that this effort was not useful in areas where sea urchin density was extensive and had no real significant impacts on lowering the overall sea urchin abundance. Divers were mainly focused on abalone catch rather than culling due to economic incentive, and spent less time diving in areas that were overrun by urchins and devoid of abalone. Large-scale efforts for sea urchin population control were taken on via management of the Tasmanian rock lobster fishery. Rock lobsters are the primary predator of sea urchins in the area, and researchers implemented a rock lobster translocation program to test whether they would be effective at controlling sea urchin density. The results demonstrated that large rock lobsters were able to sustain themselves on urchin barrens, and in reserve areas, lobsters were actually able to grow to predatory capable sizes and even spill over into adjacent areas that were not protected from fishing. Continued fishing increases the urchin barren resilience, while reversing fishing impacts decreases that urchin barren resilience. This has implications on establishing an upper size limit on lobster fishing, as well as increasing reserve areas, and this demonstrated that predatory impacts on sea urchins can assist in population control, and this can be useful in the case of Northern California through the proper management of sea urchin predator fisheries. Researchers are also experimenting with cultivating thermally tolerant kelp in order to increase the resilience of giant kelp in the face of increasing ocean temperature trends. Their hopes are to establish a permaculture project to reestablish the structure and function of Tasmania's giant kelp forests. So, researchers collected sporophylls from giant kelp individuals from areas that they believe to be better adapted to warmer waters and cultured them in lab and tested them at various nutrient and temperature levels. So, this experiment is ongoing, but as of February of this year, they've cultivated several family strains that they're calling super kelp, and they've done well after being transplanted to restoration sites. So, this study is important because if giant kelp can be bred to have a higher fitness and survival rate in warmer ocean temperatures, then there's potential for other species, including bull kelp, to have that same reaction. And this could ameliorate the effects of marine heat waves and prevent any further contraction in the range of bull kelp along the Northern California coast. Through my synthesis of these case studies, I've come up with a set of recommendations for bull kelp recovery in Northern California. Currently, culling urchins is illegal per California Fish and Game Commission, as it's seen as wanton waste. This isn't to say that there aren't exceptions that can be made, so I recommend that particular areas of high sea urchin density are open to culling efforts. Second, involvement from various stakeholders, including fisheries, is critical in this process, and the economic incentive to go out and harvest or cull urchins is just simply not there because they have no value right now. So I recommend setting up subsidized commercial urchin harvesting and culling program. Next, increased exposure to the issue is very important. Many people don't know what goes on under the ocean's surface, but it's critical for the survival of kelp forests that people understand the current devastation that kelp forests are facing, to inspire community engagement and citizen science programs that can help foster a sense of understanding of the issue. And my last recommendation for sea urchin control is to research the potential of a California spiny lobster translocation program. Currently, they do not occur in Northern California waters, although recently they've been seen as far north as Monterey. Species introductions should be well researched before implemented as to not create any unintended ecosystem consequences, but it does have the potential to help sea urchin population control. For bull kelp enhancement strategies, my first recommendation is to fund research on increased thermal tolerance of bull kelp in a similar fashion that researchers in Tasmania did. As the climate changes and ocean temperatures warm, climatic patterns become more intense and more frequent, so it's important that species can adapt to these changes if we want to avoid their complete disappearance. Along with that research, there needs to be tandem efforts to transplant bull kelp from neighboring remnant forests to promote the growth, along with increased spore released at restoration sites. And from all this review, I've realized that there isn't really one answer to restore and manage bull kelp, but there needs to be a suite of actions that can be taken all together if we want to reestablish the biomass that bull kelp once had along the Northern California coast. While the ecology and biology of kelp forests is well understood by scientists, the restoration of kelp forests on a long-term scale is not. This task has posed many challenges to researchers and marine resource managers all over the world. But we're in an exciting time for kelp restoration because research is getting funded more often and media coverage is helping spread the message. Just in the past few months, a lot has happened. Innovative kelp restoration literature has been published. A few examples include enhancing kelp growth with nitrogen sufficiency, and also simple, inexpensive kelp outplanting techniques through using something called green gravel have been developed with success. In March of this year, the California Fish and Game Commission announced an emergency regulation for the allowance of an urchin culling pilot project to occur in Mendocino that will be open to all divers. And the Ocean Protection Council is funding $500,000 worth of restorative efforts for commercial divers to participate in that. I've seen articles about kelp degradation in huge media outlets like Rolling Stones and National Geographic that I'm sure have reached large audiences. In conclusion, kelp forests and bull kelp forests in particular are critical marine resources that provide many ecosystem services and are in need of our protection. They have the ability to mitigate climate change impacts through carbon offset and have high cultural and historic importance. Right now, managers, researchers, stakeholders, and lawmakers need to act quickly if there's any hopes of restoring bull kelp forests in Northern California. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my presentation.